Okay, I think we've technically hit 9 o'clock, but I think there's still a lot of people coming in, so we'll give it a couple of minutes before we start.
As in hooray.
It's a good positive affirmation.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Russell tried to make me run a hooray for two-ray campaign. Red cheesy, yeah, that's right. Oh, mind you, we ran a Get More Muscle with Russell campaign. By-election. It's a lovely photo.
Okay, well, good morning, Global Greens, and welcome to everyone who's come up to this bright and early morning conference. I'm sure we're going to be having people coming in along the way, but just organisationally, to note that hopefully everyone collected translation kits when they came in through the door. We will be having people speaking in both French and Spanish, but in terms of the channels on your machine, 1 will give you English, 2 will give you French, and 3 will give you Spanish. So to begin by introducing myself, I'm Natalie Bennett. I'm the former leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, and I am the prospective parliamentary candidate for Sheffield Central, which is just a couple of hours along the train line over to the east of here. So we've got a really exciting panel this morning. Just to note for anyone looking at the program, there has been a couple of changes. Unfortunately, Barbara wasn't able to join us from Germany, so we do now actually have a 50-50 gender panel rather than a majority female panel. And also, as you'll find when introduced, we have not a speaker from Mexico, but a speaker from Chile. So those are 2 changes for this panel. Just to let everyone know that the way this is structured is I'm going to ask each of the panel a couple of questions, then I'm going to go to the audience for questions. We will also be taking questions from social media, so anyone who's watching this on the live feed, or indeed anyone in the hall who'd like to put in a question through social media, please just use the hashtag Greens2017 and put your question, and if we can, we'll get to that question. So what we're here to talk about today is democracy from grassroots to government. And we've got a range of countries represented here, a range of Green parties, and a range of situations of democracy. And we'll be exploring both what those states are and what, as Greens, we can do to improve them. And I have a very distinguished, wonderful panel here. Starting over from my far right, we've got Matira. That's only physically, of course. Matira Toure from the New Zealand Green Party. We have Tom Crone from the England and Wales Green Party. In his hometown, he's our candidate to be Liverpool Mayor. And then we've got Alejandro San Martin from the Chile Green Party and Anne-Marie Berabaku from Burundi Greens. So what I'm going to do is start by asking everybody a question about, is their country democratic? How does their democracy work in their country? So, Matira, if I can start from you, New Zealand, you have proportional representation. From the perspective, certainly, of the United Kingdom, it looks pretty good, but is it?
Kia ora koutou, katoa e mihi aroha kia koutou. Actually, yes. In New Zealand, we are very lucky to have a fairly stable democracy and a good quality electoral system. I would acknowledge that we have some privilege in that, and that I am going to critique our democratic system in New Zealand, but I do acknowledge that there are other places in the world where our system would be highly prized, and people fight for the kind of democratic access that New Zealanders have and we often take for granted. So I do want to acknowledge that it's a privilege we have in Aotearoa. But at the core, we have a high-quality electoral system with proportional representation, which improves the access of voters to representation in the Parliament. There are changes that we can and should make to improve that situation so that more voters are represented in Parliament. But we also have a circumstance of where the executive has a very high level of control and autonomy. And for issues like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement or issues like on climate change, where the international agreements and treaties in trade, for example, are being debated, that there is a lot of control held by the executive. The Parliament and therefore the population don't have the right to be as engaged and make decisions over that like they should. And there are still some areas where we need to make reforms in our democratic system to improve the New Zealanders' opportunity to have a say about those issues, particularly global ones that affect them the most.
And what would you like to see changed? What sort of mechanisms would you like to see introduced?
So one of the options is to make sure that there is parliamentary scrutiny, parliamentary debate and parliamentary votes required for those international agreements. On the TPPA, for example, the executive held all the control over that. There were 3,000 submissions to our select committee on the TPPA, but there was no parliamentary debate or parliamentary vote held on it. And in fact, the government then passed legislation to implement the TPPA. Despite the circumstances, international circumstances, without there being real scrutiny of that. We've had situations where, for example, the Doha Agreement around climate change only got a month's worth of scrutiny by our parliamentary system a month before the Paris conference. So we do have, we need to extend the control and the ability of the parliamentary system to engage with these agreements because they affect our people every day in their everyday lives.
Thank you. So Tom, coming to you in terms of thinking particularly, you're operating in the grassroots local government. In the UK, I think we had a lot of discussion yesterday about the need for proportional representation, the problems with first past the post at a national level in the UK. But how does local government work in the UK, particularly here in Liverpool? Is it democratic?
As you say, being a lowly ward councillor, I have focused on Liverpool as an area. I'm actually a councillor for a ward. If you walk 2.5 miles along the banks of the Mersey, you get to St Michael's, where I represent. So, Liverpool, yes, it is democratic, but obviously it is a democracy. 7 years ago, this city was run by a different political party, so power changes hands, so the sort of fundamentals of democracy are in place. But it does feel like it's been sort of slowly getting less democratic over time. For example, in 2012, when quite a lot of cities around the country had a referendum on whether to move to a mayoral system to have an elected mayor running their cities, most of the other main cities in England had a vote on that. Only one city, Bristol, voted in favour of having an elected mayor. The leader at the time of Liverpool City Council decided that it was a good idea. He thought it was a good idea, so he didn't get a referendum in Liverpool. Instead, he got all his colleagues in the council to vote for the system, instead of asking the people of Liverpool. So we had the mayoral system imposed upon us, and so we didn't have the benefit of, even that little bit of democratic insight, whether we could have a referendum to have it. And that has resulted in power in Liverpool being very much concentrated into the hands of one person. We've gone from the cabinet and leader system to the mayoral system, where one person pretty much sets the agenda. A lot of decisions are made before it ever gets to any kind of scrutiny, and it just gets rubber stamped in committees. So I'm going to steal a colleague's joke here and say that here in Liverpool, it's one man, one vote, and that man is Joe Anderson. So yeah, we're affected by personality politics with one character sort of dominating politics here in Liverpool. I don't think it's been particularly helpful. And then we've got the recent development, which is going to have probably a further sort of questionable impact on the democracy of the area. I'm standing to become the Green Party Metro Mayor of Liverpool City Region. That's a newly created role. It's the devolution agenda that's been basically carved up by the government. You described it yesterday as a stitch-up. I totally agree that that's what it is. But so some powers have been devolved down to the city region, but a condition of those powers coming to Liverpool City Region is that we have to adopt the elected mayoral system. So we've got this role. Some of the problems with the whole devolution agenda, the imposition of the mayor, but also the fact that it was, the deal was basically cooked up behind closed doors by a small collection of local politicians and central government, where all the terms were decided without any real consultation, very little public involvement, and basically the deal was just sort of presented as a fait accompli, and we're all basically going out now to campaign on a deal that was done with no consultation whatsoever. Significant problems with the way it's been designed. For example, the scrutiny of the Metro Mayor is going to be carried out by the combined authority, which is going to just be the leaders of the 6 boroughs, and they're all likely to be, unfortunately, from the same party. So they're all going to be toeing the same party line. And I don't think that's a very strong form of scrutiny.
Yep,
so we'd look for better forms of scrutiny than that.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. Now, just for people who've come in, just if you need translation, Channel 1 is English, Channel 2 is French, Channel 3 is Spanish. So I'm going to come to you now, Anne-Marie. And in Burundi, first of all, in terms of what is government like in Burundi, we're talking about democracy here. How would you discuss that in Burundi's terms?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Well, the case of Burundi, as I see it, is rather atypical, talking about democracy here. Burundi has always been marked by violent conflict, cyclical violent conflict, since the 60s, I would say. And at the present moment, we are led by one party. We actually have 44 different political parties in Burundi for a population of 9 million. 9 million, who can vote, or, some of them, of course, are not of voting age. I think it's 3 million who are not entitled to vote, but the others can vote. Now, the leading party that governs the country has actually been around since 2005, and the president was elected for a five-year mandate, a 5-year term. It is renewable. In 2015, that term was supposed to come to an end, and the president then tried to change the constitution to extend his mandate, but that did not work out for him. But nevertheless, he still wanted to carry on leading the country. So there was a campaign in 2015, which he launched, and the launching of that campaign then also triggered demonstrations, a lot of unrest in the country. So our country, Burundi, is a country where the police have taken up arms. They've actually taken up arms to shoot demonstrators using live ammunition. I think 100 people or so have died already in these confrontations, in these conflicts in the capital, Bujumbura. You have civil society organizations who were opposed to this new mandate. Some of them were placed behind bars, so they're in prison. Others went into exile. Human rights defenders, HRDs, are also put in prison. And, broadcasting media have been shut down. There have been fires. I can tell you that the radio and the television channels or rather the stations in our country, were burnt down during the time of these demonstrations. And once again, the demonstrators themselves are either in prison or in exile. And if you're looking towards the exiled population, well, it includes the Speaker of the National Assembly, of the party in power, who actually came from the same political family as the current president, the current incumbent, and in fact actually came from the same ethnic family, and who was actually on his side initially. Originally they used to work together. There's also the vice president of the country, who once again comes from the same political family as the president, from the same ethnic group, and who was also on his side. Now he's in exile. The spokesperson has also gone into exile. All this to say that in Burundi, right now, I'm not sure we can talk about democracy, really. We can't really talk about democracy. The people live in fear, and the people are expecting a disaster any minute now. We're awaiting a pending catastrophe. So it's difficult to talk about democracy in this day and age in Burundi, I'm afraid. And also, of course, we are experiencing extreme poverty. Our country is an enclave, if you like. It is actually closed and closed in on itself, too, very isolated. The international community has withdrawn its aid to our country. Your countries, I'm looking around towards you. I think your countries are countries that would like to fund Burundi, but at this moment in time, that support has been withdrawn from the international donor community. So there are declaration statements, but nothing is really happening to help change the situation on the ground. But nevertheless, I can, of course, speak about the situation before 2015. At least I can speak about that. We were fortunate enough to move towards democracy at that point. Can I carry on and say a few words about that?
If you can say where you were at that point, just very briefly.
Actuellement?
At this moment in time? Are you asking for this moment in time? At this moment in time?
Or things went wrong, perhaps.
Okay. Auparavant?
So yes, before then, we were making headway. Before 2005, we were moving towards democracy. The parties, they were able to stand for elections, even though it was quite close nevertheless, but they still were able to stand their candidates. And there was an important resource in the country, I think it's particularly important, namely women. Women in Burundi are a very important resource for us. And women were doing whatever they could to empower women in the country, to give them strength, to make sure that women could actually collect their claims and then get elected. I mean, to get elected, to stand for election, but also to go out and vote. Because what we've noticed in our countries is that very often women don't know anything about how you participate in democracy. They have no awareness of how you participate. So we've done a lot of awareness raising about that. You know, the identity card, for instance, being issued to all women. A lot of women didn't have their ID cards, but you need an ID card if you want to take part in the democratic process, if you want to go and vote and stand for election. So that was a good thing, an opportunity for us.
Back to the next round of questions, I'll be talking about what Green parties can do. But first, before that, if I just come to Alejandro, come to you and talk about Chile and how democracy is and is working in Chile.
Okay. Good morning to all. In Spanish also. Como verde, como
Yes, as a Green, an American, and also a Democrat, I have to repudiate the recent events in the Republic of Venezuela, where a very weakened democracy has been controlled by the executive power. It has really controlled the Legislative Assembly under. So as Greens, we should not confuse. It doesn't matter how attractive an electoral platform may seem to us. Such action actually undermines our principles. Today, we are thinking about the ecologist movement members in Venezuela and the millions of Venezuelans, men and women, who are experiencing such difficulties. The Green family is with you.
Respecto a la pregunta.
Now, with regards to your question, the situation in Chile, I feel that our country, as in the case of many countries in Latin America in particular, does fulfill the requirements of democracy in terms of form, but there are problems in terms of implementing our democracy in practice within the country. In the last general election in our country, less than 40% of those who were able to do so and registered to do so actually voted. Slightly more than a third. So that shows that it's not really working very efficiently, that not very many people are actually taking part. In general, transparency and corruption are subjects that are important. They're burning issues in the country, in politics in the country, and great efforts are being made to correct these issues. Until recent years, we thought that we were different to our neighbours in terms of corruption. That said, in recent years, there have been various serious cases in which financial circles, strong financial powers, have co-opted political elements, and democracy has been seriously undermined. Now, if we look at on the more micro level to grassroots democracy, not only governmental municipal levels, but associations of neighbours and the unions, I think that's where our democracy is really weakest. There's a very low level of participation in all the grassroots organisations. Probably since the dictatorship of Pinochet, this social participation has never really recovered, and that, I'm sure, is really seeping through to democracy in general in the country. Now, on the positive side, since the return to democracy, we had a binominal democratic system, two-party system, which was traditional. But in the next elections in November, we will have a proportional system for the Senate and for members of Parliament, and we feel very optimistic. We think that at least we'll be able to ensure that we attain the election of one member of the lower house.
How did you get that change about? Because lots of people, lots of Green parties, certainly from the Anglo world, are wondering how we can get from first past the post to proportional systems. How did that change come about?
Bueno, la verdad que
Well, I think the change to a proportional representation system was something that the governments had promised since the return to democracy, but because of the right, they'd actually blocked it, so it hadn't come into being. But really, this is because of the discrediting of political parties, of politics in general, and democracy. This meant that even the right-wing parties have had to give way, give ground, in order to usher in this new form of politics to fill people with enthusiasm once again. So there was really political pressure here, lobbying, but also a social and cultural movement that brought that about.
So in the next round of questions, I'm going to move to looking at what Green parties or Green movements can do to make their countries more democratic. So Matera, if I can start with you, what are the New Zealand Greens doing?
I mean, like all Green parties, the participatory democracy is one of our core values. It's in our charter. And so we are always looking for ways, notwithstanding that we have quite a robust electoral system and a robust democratic country, we are always looking for ways to improve it so that we increase not only access to the representative democracy, so people voting in that sense. And we have what's known as the missing million in New Zealand of people who don't turn out to vote, and we have to be we are very conscious of why that is. And in my view, that is largely because they have been disenfranchised, not from the voting process necessarily, although to some extent, but actually from they don't trust authority. Politicians and government are the ultimate form of authority alongside the police. But these are people who have never had the state agencies treat them with respect or decency. These are people who have been locked out of decent housing, jobs, who are continually harassed through the welfare system, who didn't get access to a decent education. And so why would they trust us to then change that for them? We can't then go out and say, please vote for us because we'll fix it for you, because quite rightly, they are very suspicious of authority. So what we have to do is get into a position to change it first for them, to show that actually we care about their lives, and then to be able to talk with them about how they want to participate in their democratic country. I think the other part of it too, though, is we need to be continually looking at new ways to engage people in decision-making. Participatory democracy is about people having the right to make decisions about the things that affect them. That is the core value. So we haven't had in New Zealand anything like a citizens' assembly, although the Greens did negotiate that with Labour, but then Labour lost the election, so it didn't happen. But we need to be looking at new mechanisms to bring more people into the decision-making process. And for the political class, if you like, to demonstrate much more trust
to the New Zealand public that actually they are entitled to make decisions for themselves about what affects them. And that is what the Greens, as we campaign for the September election this year, one of our core issues is a stable and responsible government that is more transparent, that is more open and more trusting of the New Zealand public to participate in the political decisions that affect them. So not only will we be a different government, but we will do government differently. Because how can we possibly live our values as Greens if we don't open up the political doors to enable more New Zealanders to make decisions about their own lives?
So if you're thinking of stepping into government, it's always difficult. If you take power, then there's all the mechanisms already there. How do you think you're going to change the mechanisms of government if hopefully that's the outcome?
Well, some of it will be our negotiations with our political partners in the government, but also we are now, as part of a memorandum of understanding that we have with the Labour Party in opposition, we are talking more to the New Zealand public about the nature of our relationship with Labour that we hope to then have as part of a coalition in government. And so we are trying now through this MOU and being transparent about the decisions we're making and the fact that we're having conversations with Labour and just in small ways, but trying to demonstrate that. At the same time, we're also being very active around improving the access for women and for Māori and other populations. Because we need to make sure that those who have the least power have the most access, to have better access. And so there's a very deliberate strategy to make sure that we are talking directly to women, to Māori and Pacific communities about how they can be engaged in this process in their own terms, in ways that make most sense for them, as opposed to make most sense for those of us already in politics.
Thank you. So, Tom, in terms of England and Wales, what do you think the Green Party is succeeding at, and what are we not doing so well at?
Well, first of all, it's obviously just really inspiring to be sat here with two people from two countries where they've just recently introduced PR. We all know what a huge impact that would have on British politics. If we had PR here, we'd have, 25 MPs rather than the one that we have. So it's such a patently unfair system, the one that we're lumbered here with. But fortunately, it is being proven today that it can change, that it can, countries can decide to adopt a sensible electoral system. So, that's what we've got to keep pushing for. And I think there's probably pretty much consensus that we need fair voting among the Green movement. And, we're just seeing in action what it can achieve. And, the progress being made in New Zealand is amazing. On a local level, I mentioned briefly that these new combined authority mayors are going to be held account by the leaders of the the boroughs within their combined authority areas. Here in Liverpool, if the vote goes the way it's expected, this is going to be 6 members of one party agreeing with a mayor from the same party. We'll be pushing for a system like in London, where there's a proportionally elected assembly, which means there's a range of voices on that assembly asking the tough questions of the mayor, making the decisions that he or she takes be a lot better. So that's one thing we'll be pushing for. And I think you mentioned the kind of citizens' forum system as well in New Zealand, which is something we really need here, because we're in danger of just replacing, remote decisions being made remotely in Whitehall with decisions being made by a remote mayor in combined authorities. So we need some kind of citizens' forums where people can voice their local concerns and the mayor can be held to account in that way. So we need to make changes in these directions. It's great to see that it's been done and it's been successful.
Thanks, Tom. So, Anne-Marie, coming to you, and I think I can say for everybody in this room, huge respect for the work that you and your movement are doing to take on, the very, very difficult challenges. And perhaps it's hard for us in different societies to imagine how you confront that. So, what can the Green Movement do? What is the Green Movement doing in Burundi to try and move in the direction of democracy?
Franchement, well, to be perfectly honest with you, at the moment, there's actually no political activity possible in Burundi. At the moment, nothing. All political actors, all those who are opposed to the current president, are actually in exile. And anyone who is still in the country today are people who support the president, who are with the president. So as concerns any other kind of alternative or contrary voice, it can't be heard in Burundi today. We are trying to negotiate. We've tried to initiate such negotiations, but they haven't really started to this very day because the government will not respond to our request. And therefore, if you're in the country at this moment in time, all you can really try and do is raise awareness. You have to do it, very, very gradually, but raise awareness. I don't know whether the population is prepared to listen to political discourse at the moment. Quite honestly, the population is afraid. The population is also suffering from hunger. People are leaving the country. I don't think I told you this earlier. Since May 2015, between then and today, we have registered the number of refugees in Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Congo, more than 400,000 refugees in these different countries, including women and children. So people are fleeing the country. They're still fleeing the country today because they're hungry, they're panicking, they're afraid, and the president is autocratic. He rules on everything today. So that is what's going on in our country. And if you're still in the country, you keep a low profile, you hide, you go underground, and you certainly don't say anything that might contradict the will of the president who has decided to stay in office. So, quite honestly, at the moment, there's not a lot we can do in terms of preparing for elections. I mean, elections would be an opportunity to contradict the will of the president. But, in terms of doing something with women, well, all we can do is something very gradual, very softly, because the government is controlling everything. And there's widespread fear. The government wants to make sure that you're not trying to incite the people against the government. That's making our situation difficult.
I think we can all just start off by saying an enormous amount of sympathy and concern for everyone. But just perhaps one question in terms of how, in exile, are you able to organise as an organisation in exile? Are you able to operate in any way from that exile situation?
I didn't get to it.
Are you able to operate from outside the country? What can you do from outside the country? Is there an organisation, really, that's able to operate?
Well, just a moment. Could you perhaps repeat your question?
Sorry. Yeah, the question was, are you able to operate as a movement outside the country? So, are you able to operate as a movement outside the country?
It's not easy.
It's not easy. It's not that easy. Because working from outside the country at the moment, I mean, what can I say? I've been in the country up until now. I was in Burundi up until now. And then, our movement is very disparate, if you like. There are some who are still in the country, but some who are outside of the country, so we're kind of scattered. Nevertheless, what Burundi needs right now, I think, is a lot of energy, a lot of strength, and we don't have that energy or that strength right now. We don't have it because the powers that be hold all the strength, all the force. They are able to take up violence and arms. They hold it all. What you can do from the outside is, I suppose, mobilize. You can carry on mobilizing people to put an end to the violence, for one thing, making sure that we, have non-violent means of protesting. Because we're faced with a government that is resorting to violence. But if you're looking at it from the outside, You know, we think we can carry on mobilizing people, in particular those who currently find themselves in exile, those who are in refugee camps at the moment. There are also people who aren't in refugee camps, but there are many of them outside of that, but still in exile, so we can try to mobilize them too. Mobilize for change using peaceful means, using non-violent means. Because I know people are tired and fed up, and some are thinking about resorting to violence. Some people think that it might be an idea to get organized and to use violence against violence. But our position is no, we want to use peaceful means. We are opposed to the use of violent means because violence is not a solution for Burundi. Burundi has only ever suffered from cyclical violence. So that's our contribution. And we need a lot of resources for that, an awful lot of resources to do this work. Because, like I said, the government is so powerful in Burundi. But with the support of the Greens, and that's in a way an appeal that I'm putting out to you, I'm sounding the alarm wherever you might be, please help us find a solution in Burundi using non-violent means.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. So, Alejandro, in Chile, what is the Green Party doing, pushing for more democracy? What are your hopes, I suppose?
Sí, bueno.
Yes, in terms of the action that we are taking to promote democracy, we have a very dynamic program in this respect, a hard-hitting one. So when we talk about what we are offering to the electorate in our country in terms of democracy, what we need to do, first of all, is ask how democratic our own parties are, our own national bodies, and also those who represent us internationally. And this is why, as a party, we've taken a series of measures in terms of transparency, the transparency of the party itself. We are promoting the idea that all parties should be transparent in terms of finances, funding, so that all the pesos and dollars taken in by the government or from members, received by the government or from members, should be declared, and also the use to which they were put. Also, our agenda expresses very clearly what alliances and different positions and policies the alliances we're forming, and positions that have been established by the party. And in terms of leaders, our leadership, we have a very strong campaign around the statement of personal interest. This is something that's been introduced nationally, but we are going beyond our legislation in terms of our leaders stating what their interests are in terms of the private sector or other areas. That's in terms of internal transparency of our own bodies. Now, we have also led the promotion of referendums around specific themes against, well, where I have come from. I don't come from the capital, but Concepcion, 500 kilometers south of the capital, Santiago. And in our region, on the basis of a referendum, we had a coal-fueled power plant that was installed and to be run in the country legally. So this tool is quite weak at legislative level. We've promoted its improvement and promotion nationally. Now, our platform also includes consultations for the key posts have to be actually organized for the medium term, to consult with the sectors to see whether actually still continue to back those leaders. in the Chilean parliament, we have senators and also MPs this year who will have been working as such for 30 years, 20 to 30 years. They are elected and re-elected, so we are promoting a restriction on that, their terms.
We start to move over to you, the audience here in the hall, and also the audience at home. Just a reminder that if you want to ask any questions to our panel from home, if you use the hashtag on Twitter, Greens2017, I've got a gentleman in the wings who's keeping track of these things. But I'm going to move to the hall now, so I'm going to ask you, you may need to wave if you want to ask a question, because it's quite hard with the lighting to see you. But just to sort of recap about where we've been thus far, I think we've been over a very broad range of democratic issues, going from the question of how, as Greens, we can use non-violent action against repressive governments using force, right through to issues about how we can tackle deeply corrupt governments, issues where corruption's a huge issue, through to changing electoral systems, getting to fairer electoral systems, and then getting perhaps further down the track of democracy, thinking about how we can establish a genuinely participatory democracy. I personally have a saying that politics should be something that everybody does, not have done to them. And that perhaps is the ideal, the final point we'd like to get to. So I'm looking around the audience now to see if anyone would like to raise a question from the audience. As I said, do wave, because it's rather hard for me to actually see anyone. I can see a gentleman there at microphone 1. If you'd like to go ahead, sir.
Yeah. Test. Okay, my name is Jean Cloutier. I'm from Canada, but I'm not an official delegate. I'm here also as a journalist and as a former candidate for mayor in Quebec City. So my question is to the future mayor of Liverpool, Mr. Tom Crone. Let's dream. I have a dream to be mayor of my city too, but as a Green. We founded a local Green party in Quebec City, but we didn't have success in 2007 and 2009, and we didn't expect any. But we merged our local party to the opposition party, and then in the next election in November, I think I got better chances to be a city councillor. But in our program, we want to have a proportional vote. RP, will you say? But there's many kinds. My question is, there's many kind of proportional vote. What kind of proportional vote would you like, Tom? And can you give me some detail about the one in London? Because this is the only city here you do have a proportional vote. So is that model in London will be the one you'd like? Or my real question is that if you want to have success, you need to be representing a geographic territory or district. But is there possibility for a redistribution, like a mixed proportional? Is it what it is in London or what you'd like to have?
Okay, Tom?
Okay, I have to confess to not being a massive electoral system geek, but I know that I think it's a list system in London, isn't it? So
yeah, if I can just come in on that, just in terms of what's in London, it's what's known as an additional member system, which I think is very similar to the New Zealand system. So there is individual constituencies elected through first past the post. And then there's a citywide list system, which is where the Greens get elected, and that makes the result proportional. I'm right, Matera, in saying perhaps you can just tell us what it's like how it works in New Zealand, and I'll come back to you, Tom, in a second.
That is how it works at the national level, but at our city level, many of our cities use STV, so they have at-large.
That's single transferable vote.
Single transferable vote. And so in the city I live in, Dunedin uses single transferable vote, and all of the councillors are elected at large, so it's all within the entire Dunedin area. And that means we get that broad range. We can choose the candidates from right across the city as opposed to in specific areas.
And what's the threshold for that? What percentage of vote do you need to get to? Is it about, like, there is a threshold though, so you have
Yes,
to get a
there
certain
is,
percentage?
Yeah, yeah, if I recall rightly, there is.
Yeah. Okay. So coming back to you, Tom, I mean, the reason why in the UK we tend to go towards additional member system, which is also what we've got in the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, is it keeps, you still have a local MP or a local Assembly member, which is the New Zealand system. Locally, you don't have that. So I think, why do you think it is in Britain we're so attached to the idea of that local MP or a local councillor? Is that something that's just tradition?
I think there's something to be said for it. People like to be able to say, I've got an issue in my area, I'm going to get in touch with the person who represents my area. So I think that's quite reasonable. But with the combined authority, the system that we're going to have, the mayor themselves will be elected by single transferable vote, by STV. So there's a little bit more choice available in the electoral system for the mayor. But the combined authority which holds the mayor to account is not actually directly elected at all. It's just the people who happen to be the leaders of each individual council will go into that role. I don't see any reason why the Assembly, which holds the mayor to account, shouldn't be elected specifically for the job of representing the whole city region. So I'd look at a fully proportionate list system personally, which really does reflect the will of the people across the whole combined authority. So that would give the right diversity of political parties and the right diversity of voices and reflect what people actually want within the city region. So that's what I'd go for personally.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm looking back to the audience. I can see there's, just for anyone who hasn't worked out the system, there's actually 4 microphones. So if you wish to ask a question, please go and stand at one of the microphones, and I can see it's at microphone 2.
Hello?
Yep.
Is it on?
Yep.
Okay, my name's Rebecca Warren, and I'm British. Now, it might have looked as if, for those of you who are from outside the UK, it might have looked as if the Brexit referendum last year was a perfect example of representative democracy compared to what we normally have in the UK. But I consider, and I'm sure many people would agree with me, that it was hopelessly corrupted by the fact it wasn't possible to stop participants from lying. And in particular, one well-known example, there was a bus which claimed that we sent £350 million a week to the EU, and it said let's spend it on the NHS instead. And in fact, that figure was false, and nobody had any intention of spending the money on the NHS instead. But the system we had didn't stop people from telling that lie, and it probably did corrupt the outcome of the election, considering how close it was. So I want to ask those of you who do have proportional systems, what do you do to ensure that people make genuinely well-informed choices, that they do actually act in their own interests?
Okay, so there's a question there about proportional systems and making sure people vote what we see as the right way. I think also there's a broader question there about, how do we stop lying in politics? So that's a nice simple one to tackle on a Saturday morning. Perhaps, Alejandro, if I can come to you first in terms of, how do you feel like, how much honesty is there in debate in politics in Chile, and how are people able to really make choices based on informed evidence? How do they make their choices when they vote?
Well, in terms of the system that we have, first of all, it's true that we have a proportional system in the country at local municipal level. And from November this year, that will also exist in terms of the parliamentary setup. Now, in terms of your question on how to ensure that people are well informed and vote on the basis of that information, it's complex. We live in a global world in which social media can really put across any messages. You cannot control the media, and they shouldn't be controlled. And that's a very important issue to discuss in many of our countries. The traditional media, the main media, are highly concentrated and controlled by social and political spheres. So the situation truly is complex in terms of how to inform the electorate correctly. But there is a word that hasn't come up yet, which I think should be the focus of any debate on democracy, which is education in democratic values and democratic systems. Whilst we have populations that are ignorant in terms of civil training education, we will have serious democratic problems in terms of how we elect and who we elect. So I think the heart of the problem is civic education in our educational systems.
Matera, coming to you in some ways, New Zealand looks. You are the model society on this panel. Are people making choices, well-informed choices, able to make choices in New Zealand?
Yes, because I mean, they might not be making the choices I would prefer them to make. That's true, but I don't think they're any more or less affected by the kind of trolling and the social media and the fake news issues that we see. And so it is a real struggle making sure people have access to accurate information. Their choice then about whether they engage with that is theirs. And there's no way of making people listen to your views. You simply have to find ways of getting it to them so they can choose to or not. We did have a situation in 2005 where, and this affected other countries at the time, where we had a very serious attack on the democratic electoral system, in my view, by the exclusive brethren who were working alongside the National Party, and they were funding pamphlets that were spreading all sorts of misinformation about the Greens and others. And they were, at that time, the law did not require them to say who was the author of that work and who was responsible for it. So we did go through a period of electoral law reform where the law now requires that if people are producing electoral information, they need to register. If they're going to spend over a certain amount of money, they need to register, and they need to put their names on the information that they're sharing so that at least there is some disclosure about who is behind the campaigns, particularly the attack campaigns that are run during a general election. And so that's been good. We have just now found another loophole where organisations can run very, very expensive broadcast campaigns, attack campaigns, largely with very little control, but financial control. So we have seen some changes, but I agree with Alessandra. A civics education and access to information about how your electoral system works and what your role in it and your rights in it as a citizen is critical. We don't do enough. We do a bit of that in New Zealand in our schools, but not enough. It's one of the arguments for a vote 16, for lowering the voting threshold, is that what it would require then is for the education system to be much more engaged in the political system and teaching kids about how their political system works and their rights and responsibilities as citizens. And I think that would be a big step that New Zealand could take that we haven't done yet.
I think I'm just going to reflect on that. A piece of information I learnt yesterday that I didn't know is that in Rwanda the voting age is 17, and the Rwandan Greens are campaigning for it to be 15. So that was something I learnt yesterday, which I was very pleased about. Anne-Marie, you wanted to come in.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to add a comment to this. At the 2010 elections, I was working for the United Nations, and we wanted to promote democracy in Burundi. And we initiated a program to register the different political programs of the political parties that wanted to stand for election. A lot of parties were prepared to do that. They came along to register their political programs, and then all of that was to be broadcast in the media. But the governing party, the party in power, refused to come to us to introduce its political program, and yet they too were standing for election, of course. They refused to cooperate. Why? Well, because they knew that it's not the political program on the basis of which you are elected. It's actually another alternative message that gets you elected. The message being, do you want to stay at war or do you want to be outside of it? Very often people in my country vote along those lines. You know, either stopping the war, the political programme is not so much of interest to me, you vote on whether or not you want to be at war. So sometimes, you know, this is just accepted. We accept even lies because we know that other aspects are given pride of place. I was talking about 2010, of course. Now, in 2015, it was a completely different kettle of fish. That was not the problem. In 2015, the elections actually were orchestrated by a small group of people then.
Okay. Tom, coming to you, since you were at the heart of, we started off talking about the referendum campaign. Could it have been different? Could people have been more informed, do you think?
Well, I think in general, I think I sort of echo some of the comments that have already been made, that information is key, that education is key. The more educated the electorate are, the better they'll be able to filter out the facts from the fiction. And I suppose, as Greens, we've always suffered a little bit from the fact that, you know, things like the media haven't always been so friendly to us, so it's difficult for us to get fair coverage in the media, and it's easy to get false information out through the media. So there's always been that kind of tension of our elections actually informed by proper information. So I guess that's just something we accept as part of the political process. We carry on trying to get our clear, positive messages out as much as we possibly can. And we just have to be proud that despite everything that, you know, does go against us in the information wars, so to speak, we do keep on making progress and we do keep on, you know, having our gains and our victories. And I just think, you know, the question was framed in terms of how is it different in proportional systems. I guess the difference is from a proportional system compared to first past the post or indeed a referendum. At least if a lot of people are fooled in a proportional system, it doesn't necessarily mean all the power goes to the people who used that misinformation to get the advantage. You know, it's a check, it's a balance against people, you know, dishonestly gaining absolute power.
Can I just make one more comment? Because there has been talk about the media in this conversation, and one of the things we've seen in New Zealand is the political media has been squeezed. They've been financially squeezed. There are fewer of them. With the new technologies, they're now having to do a great deal more with the very small resources that they have. So one of the big campaigns and that we've just started is on increasing funding to the public sector, to public media, to make sure that there is a really strong media access and information by those who don't have to rely on the corporates to provide that. And I think that has to be a big campaign too, to make sure that our media have access to the resources to do the investigative work that we need them to do, both of us, ourselves, but also of the other political conversations that happen.
I think I might just mention there that England and Wales, we have a policy that says it's known as the Google tax. There should be some very small tax on internet advertising, and we'd aim to have that funding small, local, independent media, particularly locally grassroots media, and I think that's a very good policy. Okay, I'm going to come to number 4 right up the back there.
Hello.
Yep.
Hello. My name's Chris McQuaid. I live locally, but I am a citizen of the world, and no one will ever convince me otherwise.
That's a bit British political reference for people who our Prime Minister suggested that no one could be that or should be that.
I thoroughly disagree. Now, I picked up on something Anne-Marie said, where you mentioned that you need help from all over the world, and I think that's fully understandable. Indeed, I think I'm right in saying the whole Green movement stands behind you in wanting to get rid of an oppressive, authoritarian and totalitarian president. My question is on that note, though. Do you believe that that help should come from NGOs and people power, or that other governments should be willing to throw their weight behind change in other countries? I say this because, as we learnt over the last 20 years, Western democracy's attempts to spread democracy, using those words very loosely, has not always been entirely successful or peaceful? I want to ask that to the panel. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to come to the panel. Just a point too, I can see there's a number of people lined up for questions. We have had 3, I believe, UK questioners. So I'd asked if we can have, if you are from the UK, if you would mind stepping back so that people from non-UK, we can get some questions in. But that question, Anne-Marie, to start with you, what would be your response to that question?
I think support has to come from all levels. All levels. I do think government need to get involved to convince the current government of Burundi, convince them that they need to sit down around a table with political opponents so that we can find an agreement for human rights defenders, those in exile, the representatives of NGOs, refugees who are outside of the country, faith communities, that all of them have the opportunity and freedom to come back to the country and to take part in the governance of the country. It is a matter of urgency. We need to be able to bring people back home. So many of them are either in Europe or in neighboring countries around Burundi. So yes, I think we need that political involvement to make sure that we make progress in Burundi in this domain. As for people power and NGOs, yes, of course, a lot of work can be done. We need to, first of all, make sure that we reassure the population. We also need to do something about hunger. There are children who are dying of hunger. This cannot go on. People are falling sick. The hospitals are unable to cope. We need to have that support too. But I would argue support at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. So, Alejandro, what's your view in terms of perhaps thinking of the Latin American context broadly? Where there really needs to be step forward in democracy. Who should be involved in that? Should governments from other parts around the world be involved in that? What should they be doing?
Well, I think that as Greens, we have to support multilateralism and do this very strongly. In thinking about Venezuela currently, we have the American group of countries that have come together to act and to see how the re-establishment of democracy can come about in that country. Yes, I do feel that there has to be multilateral action by countries, supported locally, supervising the democratic implementation of democracy in the countries. At the level of the green parties and movement, there also must exist support, a transfer of knowledge to ensure that truth can be known and conveyed. So I think that action is needed at both levels, and that's where the work has to be done.
Your sort of view from New Zealand and I'm thinking perhaps here of Pacific countries maybe that you may have some thoughts on what New Zealand, other states should be doing in specific countries.
Just recognising that there are Pacific representatives here from the island. So from a New Zealand point of view and from the work that I've been involved with in the Pacific over this, we have to be extremely careful that we aren't using democracy as simply another form of colonisation. There's a real risk. And I have been to conferences where the WTO and organisations like that have tried very hard to force the Pacific nations into agreements and into processes that are simply ineffective for those islands, for their communities, for their people and their economy. So the question then becomes, as a global movement of Greens who are committed to participatory democracy, not representative democracy, that's not in our charter, it's participatory democracy. It is then supporting those people in their own countries on the processes they believe best improve access to political decision making, to fairness, to ecological restoration within their own cultural constructs, and as opposed to, and then providing support for that. It might be our own experiences and our different ways and the different options that we've had, because there's lots of different ways of democracy existing around the world. There's not just the Westminster system that New Zealand and has. So we have to be really conscious of that, because we can become cheerleaders for our own system where it works for us, and forget that actually there are different cultures that have their own systems of working with their own people, and those we need to help, we need to support to improve. I would say this too, particularly as a Māori woman for whom, it's the same kind of approach that we need to take around feminism, for example, that feminism needs to be very responsive to the views of Indigenous women about how they want to improve their circumstances in their countries within their culture. I think the same approach needs to be taken when it comes to democracy and democratic systems.
Okay, coming to the audience again, I'm coming to microphone 2.
Merci beaucoup. Je vois que...
Thank you. I note that in these discussions, we've talked a lot about the ballot and about how we vote. But we haven't really talked about funding much so far. If I've understood you correctly, I mean, in my country, in Mauritius, if you are a candidate and if you want to stand for election, you need to place a deposit. You deposit a certain amount of money. And then, of course, there's all the costs related to your campaign. I'd like to hear from our panelists, what's the situation in your countries? Is it similar?
Okay, Tom, I can come to you first, because I may have a little inside knowledge on this one. What about the mayoral elections in Britain?
Sorry, what elections are that?
The mayoral, the metro mayor elections.
Yes, okay, so you're absolutely right. Funding of political parties is a big issue. We were supposed to be joined by a German representative today, where I believe they have state funding of political parties. So depending on the share of the vote you achieve, you get funding up to that level, which means that you're able to campaign kind of in line with the support that you have among the populace, which seems a much better system to me than here, where you're kind of on your own and you have to raise every penny you possibly can to campaign and get your message across. So it would have been interesting to hear from a German representative today on that subject. Regarding deposits, yes, we do have a deposit system here in the UK. For a general election, for a constituency, it's usually £500, and you need to achieve 5% of the vote to get it back. For the mayoral election, which I'm taking part in at the moment, I've yesterday, in fact, handed over £5,000 to our local authority in order to participate in this election. So for a relatively small party like the Green Party, that is a big challenge, raising that kind of money. We did have to sort of strain every sinew to make sure we could do that. And there'll be a lot of people who would have wanted to stand, would have had a distinctive message that they would have wanted to present in this election, but they simply won't have been able to. So I do think there's an issue with the deposit system, particularly when it gets set at such a high level as £5,000.
Matera, what's the situation in New Zealand?
We have a deposit for the general election. It's $300 New Zealand dollars, so it's not excessively high, and a threshold for having it returned. We don't have state funding of political parties, and we have quite severe restrictions on the use that the parliamentary parties, or the parliamentary wing of a party, can use their money. We're not allowed to, as the parliamentary wing, we can't spend our money on votes, members, or asking for more money. So, so the party has to raise funds itself. We have a spending limit in our elections, depending on how many electorate candidates and how many candidates we're standing. The Greens have never spent to that limit, and our fundraising comes primarily from small donations from many people over the whole period. So we don't often get very large donations from corporate entities, for obvious reasons. And we also want to restrict, actually, the amount of money that can be acquired by parties through those big donations, to make sure that parties have to engage in their fundraising in a much more democratic and open way. And they can't just be funded by big corporations. So we have quite stringent policy on that, but the actual system it doesn't quite get us there. We do believe there should be state funding of political parties, and we think that that would be a wiser way of ensuring that parties are constrained in their funding, but also more transparent as to who is funding them. And we have had some law change to improve that transparency because the New Zealand public need to know if political parties are being funded by large corporations, they're entitled, they should know that so that they can make judgments for themselves about the nature of that political party and their policy.
Okay, Alejandro, coming to you, you made reference to the funding and corruption issues. How would you like to see progress in Chile? What sort of change would you like to see?
Bueno,
Well, there's quite a lot of change in this respect in the country currently. We don't really know what will happen. As I said, we'll have a general election, and it will be the first time that certain measures will be implemented in terms of funding and expenditure. Firstly, corporation funding has been banned. So far, companies were able to fund political parties, but that's no longer the case in candidates. It can only come from individuals, that funding, and not from companies. And also, for less than a year now, we've been having state funding. All political parties, depending on the number of people registered, their members receive a certain amount of funding, which it really varies from the small parties to the larger ones. There's a great gap in terms of what they receive. Then there is also funding based on the votes that you obtain in the campaign. So really, well, we'll see what the situation is in terms of our results. The refund. An important aspect of funding is a ceiling on expenditure. It's quite difficult to monitor when the authorities are quite weak. They have a small number of civil servants supervising how much thousands of candidates spend and different types of expenditure. So really it's a challenge for us to work out as a country.
I'm now going to go to a question from social media so that we're utterly fitting into being truly international and people who aren't in the room can have a say. This is a question from Sean Mulcahy, and his question is, how can Green Party support grassroots LGBT+ movements and advance their concerns in Parliament and government? And I'm just going to broaden this out a little to the panel to say, how can we support different minority groups, different groups within society who are underrepresented? As Greens, what can we do? Matira, you made some reference to this, but I think it's a case of, how do we get those voices really heard in society? What do you think we can do?
I think there's two major means. One is having those communities represented in Parliament through the Green Party. I myself only joined the Greens because somebody like me who held my values and who I knew was elected to Parliament in 1999. That was Nandel Tanksos, New Zealand's first Rastafarian MP. And this was a person who I respected and understood, and he took my language. And so I knew he could represent my views in Parliament. And I wanted to support the organisation that gave him that authority and that position. And so we have to keep making sure that in New Zealand, our list is very diverse, that it keeps reflecting the New Zealand population as it changes, so that we have representatives from all those communities who have access to the ability to be elected and to be able to speak for themselves. Because, like I say, we all commit to participatory democracy, not just representative democracy. So we need to make sure that people have access to power and authority. And then the second part for the Green Party in New Zealand is we pride ourselves on a strong connection to grassroots and activist organisations. We come from that culture, so we understand ourselves to belong to them. And that means we have to be continually talking with those organisations to make sure that we stay on track, because we are also now part of the establishment and it's easy to be captured by it, the corridors of power. But we rely on those organisations holding us to account for making sure we are promoting their issues, that we are standing up for them in in politics, that we are advocating for the policy that will make their lives better, while also making the space inside our own organisation for them to participate and represent themselves.
Alejandro, how do you in Chile aim in those directions?
Sí, es
Yes, this is really just somewhere where we're just setting out on that path. Well, I'd like to mention again the elections in November, when we, for the first time, are going to have a system of representation of women. So far, well, now at least 40% of each gender have to be included on the list. So this is just a first step. We also have, as an important issue, the Indigenous representation. We'd like to have Indigenous representation up in Parliament, and also recognise their system of parliaments where they constitute the majority of the population. So our platform is quite aggressive around this, around Indigenous, autochthonous people and women. In terms of the gay community, lesbian community, their representation, of course we support their inclusion in our lists, and we want to represent their view of the world and support their participation. But as a country, these are subjects that haven't matured, and we haven't actually achieved legal acceptance in that respect.
I think we would all acknowledge the enormous difficulties you're working under, but just how can you, as much as you can, ensure that the Green movement in Burundi represents a breadth of different communities, represents different people, a range of people in Burundi?
Voilà, la première chose.
Well, the first thing to do, I think, would be to change our attitudes and change our day-to-day behaviour. That's actually the most important thing, to be inclusive, to understand that there is diversity out there and that we live with that diversity. So before changing policies, I would argue that the first thing we need to do, all minority groups, or the groups who have been misunderstood to date, all of them need to be integrated. That's one of our values. We want to be inclusive, and we want to ensure that any individual, whoever they may be, that individual deserves respect. You have a right to respect and a right to be understood. Then, when it comes to promoting participation in decision-making bodies, promoting visibility, demonstrate that every individual has the right to live and to participate fully in the management of our society. We start with the movement, within our movement, because any individual is an individual with full rights. And of course, yes, we're faced with conservative forces in our population. There is a conservative streak to the population. We therefore need to proceed, step by step. We don't want to either make things difficult and get people's backs up. That would just set us back. But little by little, step by step, I think we can move forward and move towards a better understanding for political participation, and before that, a change in attitude, a change in our day-to-day behaviour in rural areas, in urban areas, and of course starting with our very own movement, making sure that there is space for all these individuals within our movement where they can fully exercise their rights. On the question of women, I think that that is a debate that we can't wait with. We need to have that debate now. Women must participate. Women must be present in politics. With regard to the quota, we have a very low quota at the moment, a very low rate, but we're working on it, and it's an issue that we're fighting for. We will fight to the death if necessary. We want to make sure that women are able to participate at every level, up to the highest level of the state. Thank you.
So, Tom, thinking perhaps particularly at the local politics level, the grassroots level, how can Green Party support local LGBT plus groups, local ethnic minority groups, local groups of otherwise unrepresented people? How can that work from a local council level?
I'm basically speaking more generally about the Green Party. I mean, I'd largely echo a lot of the good comments that have already been made. Here in the UK, obviously, the situation is probably somewhat better for LGBT in that equality is generally accepted, that there is, equality is kind of built into law. But we all know that sort of casually and within our society, discrimination still exists, and there's a lot of people with who don't really uphold those values. And I'm always very proud that the Green Party does strive to create that kind of safe space to have a very open and broad discussion about issues of inclusion, of equality. There's never a conference agenda that doesn't include some very sort of deep and interesting discussion about these issues, and I'm very proud that the Green Party always strives to do that. And I guess on a local level, what we need to do is work to make sure that locally we provide that safe space, an inclusive space where people can come along and feel free to express themselves however they wish to, and just try and uphold those values in everything we do, and make sure that the people we have an opportunity to influence, we can uphold those values and try to influence others to be more inclusive.
Okay, well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to apologise to the people standing at the microphones, because I'm afraid we have run out of time, and we do have to try and keep these sessions to time. But I would ask you to join with me, first of all, in thanking the panel. I also want to say that we have the hashtag Greens 2017. This is a discussion which hopefully we can continue online. We can continue in the corridors with the members of the panel. So if you haven't had a chance to ask a question, perhaps you might be able to buttonhole one or more of us later. And finally, to say thank you to everyone in the audience and at home who's participated in this. I think everyone can give themselves a round of applause. That sounds democratic.